All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So we'll start. I think you are able to see the slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So if you recall, we finished at the forms of ownership in the previous class, and here basically in this segment of our discussions, we are trying to find out that how we can compare economies. So we can compare economies across different parameters. So one of the parameters was that we discussed in the previous class was forms of ownership. That's where the capitalism, socialism, command capitalism, market socialism. So all of the issues came, and as we proceed with this class, I mean with this course, we will be able to classify certain economies in those categories, in these categories that we are talking about. So what we are trying to do is basically we are trying to lay the foundations in terms of conceptualizing the things, and then we will try see and compare and contrast whether these economies, which economies are actually performing well and which are not performing well, and what contributes and what influences those performance. That basically our target. So today we will start with the role of planning, and so here the many comparative economists emphasized the contrast of market versus plan, you know, as a being the main distinction between economic systems rather than our choice of like traditional versus market versus command. Now, why that is the case, that basically we will try to enumerate further. Now, in a centrally planned economy, what happens is that the planner's preferences dominate allocative decision making process, isn't it? And so the planners basically have certain things in their mind and they just try to implement that. Whereas in contrast to that, in a market economy, consumers' sovereignty dominates the allocative decision making process. So here the markets are basically nothing but it's basically reflections of what consumers want and what are their preferences, and those preferences are actually reflected in the form of price that influence the supply and demand forces and so on and so forth. So it is possible to have central planning uh, coincide with the market capitalism. Okay, that basically means that you know uh, which is a different variety of economies have come up with this kind of form. So the central planner, these are basically two extreme points that you are talking about, where the central planning board basically determines everything from A to Z, what economies, how economies should be run, what should be produced, and how those products should be distributed, etc., as opposed to the market economy where everything is decided by the consumer sovereignty. But these are two extreme points, but in between we can have a variety of them. Like one is that the planned market economy, where it's basically coinciding the central planning with market capitalism. In many countries, basically it is termed as indicative planning. For example, when we discuss France, Japan, they are basically dominant indicative planning economies. Only thing is that they lack the command element. Okay, and so that part we will discuss as we will proceed. The next is basically, uh, now let me just say a few words here. I think it's important that, even in market capitalist economies, planning is done by specific government agencies involving in infrastructure investments in areas such as transportation networks, which in most economies are in the public sector. Even in India also, like, the the National Highway Authority, etc. They are all basically public sector enterprise who are entrusted with developing highways, network, etc., transportation networks. Now, for such cases, the pro-market capitalists, uh, basically argued that, there is a strong case for planning if it is carried out intelligently and is also accompanied by the use of market mechanisms such as congestion controls on highways to ensure efficient use of the resulting infrastructure, which we have this, toll plaza and all that, basically rationing the, use of that. Although the, ideologies of market capitalism generally eschew planning, most largely the corporations do engage in long range planning. Now, such planning formed an important part of the argument made by, for example, John Kenneth, that the American and Soviet economic systems were converging on being partly planned, partly marketed. It's called the new industrial states. So, what I'm trying to say in this is that there is nothing like pure market and pure, uh, planned economy. There is always the possibility of using market instrument. Just 1 second. Just hold on. Okay. So, um, so what I'm trying to say is that, there is absolutely no, you know, uh, segregated compartment that, okay, this is, the market capitalism this is planned, but there is always this possibility of integrating both. And so now let's look at the types of incentives. Here also we can compare economies. Now here basically the economies vary according to the incentive schemes that motivates people to work and produce. Now we will very clearly see in case of market economy as well as in case of socialist economies what kind of incentives the economy produce and give people to encourage them to motivate them to work and produce. The most common incentive scheme is material, basically paying people according to their productivity. And so how do they do in terms of both capitalist economy as well as socialist economy? So in market capitalism, this involves paying them their marginal product that maximizes profits for competitive firms hiring labor in such a system. So that's the basis on which the market competitions functions in an economy, where the factors of productions gets their due on the basis of their marginal productivity, okay, and which is the dominant the systems in the new classical economies, which is what we are having currently. The material incentives under market capitalism takes different forms. Okay, one is that rewards for entrepreneurship, and the economic profits for capital investment, the interest for savings. Now we may ask, question that why do entrepreneurs innovate things? Why do they spend time and their resources to innovate new way of doing business, new product design, and so on and so forth? There is always reward for that in the profitability and so many other things, share of market. And so similarly the capital owners who are having capital, so they basically invest to get profits out of the investment. And we also do, the householder, they saves money in return of the interest. So these are some of the material incentives that are provided under the market capitalism. Whereas in socialism, they rejects all of these profits. Especially in theories, which we will discuss in next couple of classes, in terms of how do the capitalist theory works and how do the socialist theory works. And in theory also, the new traditional economy that we discussed in the previous class, like Islamic economic systems, they reject receiving any interest payments. Now there basically again this interesting phenomenon that how do those banks and the financial system work without the interest motive, or without having to charge interest. So that's again we will explore as we will proceed with this class. Now there are again moral incentives, which is again another kind of, as opposed to the material incentives, that also is important, or driving or other important motivating factors for people to contribute, that trying to motivate workers in terms of appealing them to for some higher collective goals, such as the great proletariat cultural revolutions in China that happened under Mao Zedong in 1966 to 76, which we will discuss in detail when we discuss Chinese economy and so on and so forth, and how that has galvanized people's movement, and they brought tremendous change in the economic and social systems in there. Then, of course, there was a slogan under this, the great proletariat cultural revolutions, that is, they serve the people. So all the people, they just, went with that movement and try to do something. Then, of course, in typical democratic setups and with a lot of the nationalistic movement that's going across countries in the world, there is always this nationalistic appeal during wartime or during economic crisis or during let's say food shortage and all of that. You know, they are basically this what they call the new traditional economic system that depend on those moral incentives. Work for the country, work for the nation, and so on and so forth. So these are some of these moral incentives that also motivate people to work for a cause as opposed to the material incentives. And the other way to look at in terms of comparing economies is income distributions, redistributions, and social safety nets. Now, economies again vary based on the context or the extent to which and the methods by which governments intervenes to redistribute income. Okay. Again, this depends on how unequal income is to begin with before any redistributive policies are actually implemented. Now, the interesting thing that the Karl Marx, who is the originator of the socialist systems or communism in the world, he had put a very ideal goal of what he says is that pure communism is as being from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Now that's basically the main the mantra as far as this Karl Marx idea of achieving equality in the society is concerned. So in the sense that there has to be some distributions take place from the people who are able to produce things, and that should go to the people who those not able to produce, and they also have their own needs. And so those part we will discuss in detail when we will get into the ideology of socialism, Marxism, communism, and what are the basic core ideas, and how do they work in terms of running an economic systems, tackling all kinds of problems, the poverty, the environmental conservations and inequality, and creating job, etc. So all of that we will discuss. Now, one of the implications of this is that the redistributions of income is that every country try to become equal or try to at least maintain some sort of equity. But in the process, there is always the issue of losing efficiency. So that's what it's called, the equity efficiency trade-off, and there's a serious trade-off in that, and especially in open economy, where whenever the government try to make efforts to make income more equal, this will eventually result in less efficiencies, meaning that less rapid economic growth. And because some of these resources are actually transferred from highly productive hands to the low productive hands, and that's basically the the thing that happens in case of the government trying to intervene to bring some sort of inequality, assess equality in the system. Okay, and so the last segment is about is about the role of politics. Now here again, the relationship between politics and economics. Now this has been a subject of deep debate, and you know uh, for hundreds of years. So until uh, nearly 100 years ago, there was no distinction between the disciplines as far as, I mean, the politics and economics. They are called the political economy, and so many in fact uh, uh, in a typical case, in many still think that that's how it is, it should be, and also believe that they cannot be really separated. um, what is the what is at the heart of the linkage is the ideology which basically connects certain political and economic systems, and they are basically given some kind of labels in terms of communism or in terms of liberal democracy and all of that. And so whether or not political democracy is indissolubly linked with market capitalism and command socialism with dictatorship is a matter of controversy. And that there are basically again claims and counterclaims that they which says that the welfare state redistributions can lead to command socialist dictatorship. And so there are, for example, the Milton Friedman, who supports these views in his book that the capitalism and freedom, where he argues that now even if expanded government activity doesn't lead to full-blown dictatorship, it constitutes a reduction in the freedom of the individuals to choose what to do with his or her income because of higher rates to pay for larger government. And such views are labeled, the what they call libertarian, and have deep roots in American and British political economic thought and experiences. The idea that there should be minimum government economic intervention is called laissez-faire. So the and so both Hayek and Friedman associate socialism with political dictatorship, and in the command socialist economy of the former Soviet Union, this was the case. And which is the in North Korea what we see. And so there are, of course, there are dictatorship in of the proletariat as well. We have seen historically in Russia and many other countries, for example, under Joseph Stalin. And so the ideological father of communism, let's say Karl Marx, claimed that communism entailed the withering away of the state. Is basically the state doesn't exist in case of communism. The dictatorship of the proletariat was to be a strictly temporary phenomenon. And so the well aware of this, that the Soviet communism or communists never claimed to have achieved communism. Instead, they always labeled their own systems socialist rather than communist. And it's basically viewed it as a kind of transition to communism. So there are basically historically what we've seen, what Marx predicted, or and what he has foreseen. It didn't actually turn out to be true in many cases. Even today, also in China, they don't say the communism. They are saying the socialist economic model, but there is actually the dictatorship economy where the central planners take the most of the decisions guided by one individual and his thoughts and so on and so forth. So there are basically, so here what you could see is basically that there is always the role of politics and political ideology. Okay. Now let us see that what are the criteria for evaluating economies. Okay. Now there are basically 9 criteria by which the relative performance of economic systems can be compared. One is that the level of output, that is the real per capita income, which we all know and very famous and indicator. The second is the growth rate of output, which is basically a Malthusian low-level equilibrium trap. It's also known as relative backwardness hypothesis. And then we have this, the um, now what basically they say is that the very poorest uh, can be caught in Malthusian low-level equilibrium traps, wherein little investment occurs because nearly all output is absorbed by consumptions merely to stay alive. And the middle to low income countries that have escaped from such traps can borrow technology from the most advanced economies and play catch up according to the relative backwardness hypothesis. So these are basically, two hypotheses that the people, try to look at the economies on the basis of the growth rate of output. So we have this Malthusian low-level equilibrium trap where people don't have surplus to buy technology from other advanced countries to produce more. Whereas in case of relative backwardness hypothesis, where the low-income countries or middle-income countries, they have surplus and they can use those surplus to buy modern technology from advanced economies and then try to do a catch-up with the developed countries. Then the third criteria that can be used to evaluate economies is the compositions of output. Now, that's again is interesting in the sense that the compositions, or the consumptions and investment goods, you can see which kind of goods that the economies are actually producing. Is it consumption goods or is it investment goods? And also we have to see that out of the total production that is taking place in the economy, what is the share of military output? And as contrast to civilian output or goods, or how much percentage of goods are produced by public sector and how much of them are produced by private sector. Can give a lot of indications and in terms of assessing the or evaluating the economies. Sometimes people commented in terms of the Soviet or Russian economies where they produce huge amount of military goods as opposed to the civilian goods, and which requires for the improvement of the welfare of the people. Then the fourth is static efficiency thing, which is basically formally this means a Pareto optimality. The idea that no one in society can be made better off without making someone else worse off. That's basically the Pareto optimality. So in this situation, resources are fully utilized to their best potential given the existing technology, and as much is being produced as can be produced. So static efficiency implies that the labor force is fully employed and that the composition of goods being produced is what people want. So it is widely argued that market economies are more successful in this area although relative success is rather difficult to measure. And market economies tend to have worse unemployment than the command economies. This is the fourth criteria to evaluate the economies. Then comes fifth is what we call the intertemporal or dynamic efficiencies, which involves the allocations of resources over time to maximize long-run sustainable growth. So an example of non-sustainable output maximizations was the effort by North Korea to cut down forests for energy and construction uses, which has led to flooding and damage to agricultural productions and then to famine. So therefore, the long-run sustainability of growth depends on maintaining a viable environment, and the failure to do so was an important factor in bringing about the fall of the Soviet bloc, the command socialisms. With long suppressed environmental movements rising against the established governments to support the end of those regimes. Then sixth is basically the macroeconomic stability. Uh, so here, the lack of large oscillations of output, employment, or the overall price levels, which is what actually the all about the macroeconomic stability. And we can see across economies whether which economies are actually having this the standard quality. So it is usually argued that the strict command economies achieve greater short-run macroeconomic stability, although there have been some spectacular exceptions. And so indeed the few remaining command socialist economies such as North Korea have exhibited greater macroeconomic instability since the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So seventh is economic security of the individual in terms of income, employment, and related matters such as health, etc. Now, this criteria is, of course, partially related to the previous one, but it also depends on the broader social safety nets of an economy, with these generally, being greatest in the European and socialist market economies. And eighth is the degree of equity of income and wealth distributions. So generally, the socialist and social market economies have more equal distributions than strictly market capitalist economies. And so the ninth is the degree of freedom. The degree of freedom available to the individuals in terms of work, consumptions, property, and investment, as well as more broadly in the civil and political realms. So market capitalist economies are well ahead of command socialist economies in this area. And so now many of the criteria listed are are difficult to quantify. Nevertheless, a summary of indexes of some of these presented will be which we will look at it as we proceed, and then see that how they pan out across the countries. Now our last segment of this is the new approach to compare economies, what we call the alternative approach. So here it can be argued that despite our emphasis on such ideas as the new traditional economy, all of the above is really a continuation of traditional comparative economics as it was done during the days of Cold War time, and also the grand ideological conflicts between capitalists or capitalism and socialism as exemplified the conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so, of course, there are minor modifications happening both in terms of market capitalism and socialisms in the form of some of these varieties of capitalism that we have seen, as well as the socialisms. And the odd occasional other forms such as the new traditional economy, and that is also evolving over the period of time. So the another approach that takes a new institutional economics perspective, uh, the new institutional economics as opposed to the institutional economics uh, perspective, is that um, the the proposed is basically which it calls the new comparative economics. The new comparative economics, which is an alternative way to look at only from the lens of socialism versus capitalism. Okay, and these approaches possess the idea of an institutional possibility frontier, which is what in this graph you can see the institutional possibility frontier, which is convex to the origin, such as which is basically it basically retains a strong component of the old comparative economics, in that there is a focus on the roles of the private and public sector in an economy. Okay. However, this competition is posed in terms of social losses that arises from a society either being too private sector or too public sector oriented. Now, as we know that in an economy, both private sector and public sector, they operate side by side. But it would be interesting to see that whether a particular economy is having a too much private sector or having a too much public sector. And the idea is that a given society at a given time is subject to potential social losses due to either a sector engaging in predation, or to rent seeking or other corrupt activities, thereby damaging efficiency. So ultimately, the danger from too much private sector is disorder. Okay, and while from too much public sector, it is dictatorship. So if you are saying, I mean, what you are basically trying to say is that if the economy is moving towards too much private sector, then it may lead to disorder. There will be a lot of corruptions, rent seeking, and many other things. Or if it is moving towards too much public sector, then it can lead to dictatorship of one person's, taking almost all the decisions. Okay. And so as a result, there will be a social losses in terms of the loss of efficiency. Okay. And so for a particular society, there is some best balance between the two that minimizes the aggregate losses or cost of both of these forms of potential predation. So it is recognized that with various changes in politics, culture, and economy, the positions and even shape of the curve may shift and change. Okay. So while the new comparative economics has received a lot of attentions and become quite influential, it must be also noted that it has some weaknesses and limits. And some of these, have more to do with the argument that, their analysis, with the concept itself, there's that this considerable emphasis has been placed on the role of legal origins and the supposed superiority of the common laws systems that gradually evolved in countries like Great Britain. as opposed to the civil law systems that derived from Roman law, especially the exemplified in the in France. So there are also these the studies that support the idea that in Africa and some other locations, nations that were colonized by Great Britain may be doing better economically, holding other factor constants than those colonized by France and Spain. So it is not obvious that these differences can be traced to differences in law codes. So indeed in the nations of their origins like Great Britain and France, it's also not obvious that the former has done better economically over the long run than the so all of these are basically point that the fact that there is this uh, the new comparative economists who stress different points at different aspects of this, whether this too much private sector or too much public sector. So therefore it is clear that the new comparative economists they are putting different elements that are involved in where actually and how close to the origin this what we call the IPF, the cost of predations would be, and so now much of these results may involve the cultural factors such as as emphasized in the traditional economies. So one way of trying to get at this outcome is to search for combinations of economic and cultural factors. And so what you're basically looking at is that the graph here, if you are looking at that, uh, the institutional possibility frontier, which is basically uh, moving on this path in a particular economy where whether the economy is actually moving towards more towards private independent judges, etc., and private orderings, and thereby creating more disorder in the society. And that means again the society has to incur huge losses due to too much disorder. And or if the economy is moving towards more state regulation and state ownership, that means public sector, then they are likely to move towards the more dictatorship kind of systems. Again will be losses towards the economy. So it's basically the tangent point is basically the total loss minimization that is that can be seen with this diagram. So this is one way of looking at the or comparing the economy, what we call the new comparative economics using institutional framework. Okay. Now, so let us now look at each of the cases. So what we discussed so far is that that how do we compare economies and what are the different criteria for evaluating economies. And in all of this, what we said, I mean, what we discussed is that there are two dominant theories in that. One is that the capitalism, another is socialism. So let us first look at capitalism, and then from there we'll move into the socialisms in detail. Okay. So do you have any questions so far? This is basically the setting the background, I mean the context that you know which will give you an idea what is lying ahead, uh, and how we are going to, uh, compare the world economy or the economies of the world, different countries, using all of these framework. Okay. So, okay, if you don't have questions, then we will move into this, the theory of market capitalisms. I think that all of you have, done the microeconomics, so it'll be easier and it'll be quicker because we already know basically how the market economy functions, what are the underlying reasons, and why countries are moving towards more uh, market oriented economies, and so what are the virtues of this market capitalism, and so that, and also the limits to market capitalism, that's more important. Okay, now let's first look at the what is happening in the world. So as you can see that there has been a vast changes taking place throughout the world, where the focus has been on the nature of capitalist economic systems. Okay, and the market capitalist economies are moving towards pure market system. Okay, like the examples of Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong has been in recent times. The freedom has been curtailed to a large extent by the Chinese new security law, national security law, and that is basically again. But it was once upon a time it was one of the freer pure market economic systems. Of course, Singapore is one. Singapore has again maintained this, very close to pure market economic systems, and also the New Zealand. And so the dynamic efficiencies or technological dynamism, which is the point that drives the market economy and the supremacy of market economy, and so it is known as the creative destructions by the Joseph Schumpeter. Uh, Means the every time the old equilibrium is overcome by the new equilibrium through technological innovations, new product designs, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the new equilibrium is replacing the old one, and therefore it's continuously in a movement, and that is why it's called dynamic efficiency through technological innovation, and so question basically in this context that can be asked is, why do some of the world's highest real per capita income countries have economies that are market capitalist, such as the United States? Okay, and so probably the strongest reason is the general ability of markets to allocate goods and resources efficiently through the law of supply and demand. Okay, now you see that so what is that which is behind these efficiencies of the market systems? And so one way to look at is a complete competitive full information general equilibrium. That's basically the in one sentence we can summarize that why do market economies are doing well compared to the other form of economies. So what does it mean by complete competitive full information general equilibrium? Why it is so efficient? And that is basically precisely the point that we will be investigating step by step, and see that the market economies is the best way to tackle a lot of these problems that the economies are facing. And so with this we can see that there are a lot of experts that basically strongly suggest that economy should be freer, the government intervention should be minimum, and so on and so forth. Now, question basically will be uh, we'll be asking is that why why the market economy systems are actually efficient, and what makes it more efficient. That's basically the point that we'll be asking. So now let us look at what are the theoretical efficiency of market capitalisms. Is that first is of course the complete. What do you mean by complete? Complete means for any good or service that affects someone's utility, there is a market. So in that sense, that anything in an economy that is useful to human being, there should be a market for that good. That is the starting point. Okay, and we will see that this kind of understanding is no longer exists in socialist settings, right, or economies that are at least having socialist framework, and that is why they are basically missing the point. The point that is that if a particular product is having value to human being, then there should be a market for that. Okay, this is what is called complete. Then the competitions. So in that market where these goods are there are valuable goods will be sold and bought, in that market there are many buyers and sellers. It's not that only one buyer will be there or one seller will be there, and there would be free entry and free exit, and there are well defined homogeneous goods and services, and no individual supplier has any control over the price in his or her market. It's a typical microeconomic uh, perfectly competitive market theory. I mean the assumptions that we are trying to bring in here. Okay, then the third is basically full information. That means that all the agents involved in the economy know everything about consumer preferences, production technologies, prices, and anything else that might need to know in deciding how to act. Okay, so therefore the full information, both the buyers and sellers, they are having full informations about everything involved in the process of production consumption. Okay, now then of course general equilibrium, in the sense that every single market is in equilibrium, in the sense that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded of the goods or services in question. So that basically means that all the markets, both input market and product markets, are in equilibrium. Okay, and that's basically the general equilibrium criteria that is actually you know uh, at sea. So as I said that if you look at this production possibility frontier, I think already you may have seen this. So here we are basically trying to look at the military goods and civilian goods. Okay, and so if you look at this production possibility frontier, so there are basically uh, two indifference curve here, right? And you could see that, and they have different points. Now, what is more interesting about is that if anything that operates in this production possibility frontier, then we see that we basically say that the economy is in actually full equilibrium, that all the resources fully utilized, and those goods are actually distributed among all the people, and there is no possibility to further maneuver over that. And that is basically the point that what we are saying is in the production possibility frontier. The point is basically if you compare A and B, okay, in both cases, uh, you know, uh, we could see that they are operating on production possibility frontier. So, which point would be producing best outcomes for the economy? How do you judge? So between this A and B. So what are the criteria to use to assess this among these 2 points? Of course, both are operating in production possibility frontier. Okay. So according to you, which one would be the efficient one and why?
Point A,
Why?
because it has a combination of the quantity of both the goods. Means that is which
Mhm.
is means that will maximize the utility.
Okay. So it's taking a higher level of utility. Okay. Social welfare function is higher, isn't it? That's what you're trying to say, isn't it? So if you
Yes, sir.
compare, yeah, if you compare between C and B, for example, they are operating under same social welfare function, and so what is the difference between these two then, C and B? Hmm? Anybody? What is the point C is called? This is Pareto. This can be called as Pareto optimal, isn't it? What about point C? Hmm? Have you seen this graph before or not? Or you are seeing for the first time? Hmm? Production possibility frontier. Hmm? Are you all there? Dev, Vidip, are you there? Okay, that means they're not present, I think. Vidip, you are not there, right? Abhishek also not there. Others? Adrija, you're not there. Akshat, are you
Yes,
there? Are you present?
yes, sir.
Okay. So how many of you are present? Can you just raise your hands? Let me see. Okay. Mhm. Only 16. 22 out of 50. Very interesting. Okay. Okay, so rest of them I am just putting absent. They are not there.
Sir, actually, I was here. My line got disconnected and I was switching to my phone.
Who? Okay. Adrija. Okay.
Sir, same for me as well.
Okay. So all of you are now woken up. It's very difficult actually to make out whether you are listening or not if you're not responding to the questions. So it's basically it's a tough task to take class online because unless there is some sort of engagement and interactions, very difficult to make out. And also the class becomes like one-way traffic. That is not good at all. So I was asking that, what is the point C called? The one is the Pareto optimal condition, the Pareto optimality. The other one is what is C called? We are here. Okay. So there is it's called Pareto improvement. Although the equilibrium is actually in the same social welfare function, but then there is a room to improve because it is yet to reach the frontier. And so all of this basically becomes very, very important. And but then in this process, we could see that the civilian versus military goods. But if you look at compare A and B, the A is actually producing higher level of civilian goods compared to the B. I mean point P, where too much military goods are produced, which is not good for the welfare of the consumers, isn't it? And so that's precisely the point that we are saying that and so in case of production possibility frontier, that's what we said, that if someone can be made better off without making someone else worse off, then the economy is not producing as much as possible of what people want. Okay. But if Pareto optimality holds, no more of what people want can be produced. Right? So all that can be done is to reshuffle existing goods, services between people. Okay. Again, we are saying that not all points on the production possibility frontier are efficient. Some may represent combinations of goods and services that people do not want. Okay. Like we are saying that the pharmaceutical economy may have been on its production possibility frontier, like point B, but was thought to produce too much military equipment and not enough civilian consumer goods. Okay. So more interesting thing is about production possibility frontier is that it doesn't tell anything about income distribution. So an economy might be efficient according to Pareto if it has completely equal distributions of income, or if one person has everything and everyone else is starving to death. There are these two possibilities are also there, if you are using only production possibility frontier. So just as long as no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off, the necessary conditions for which is the Pareto optimality. And so again, this doesn't tell anything about income distributions, who is having how much. So there is a tendency to unequal wealth and incomes under market capitalism. And this has been one of the major argument against the market capitalism, which is raised by the socialist critics. Okay, and that we will discuss as we will proceed. Okay. Now let us look at the theoretical efficiency of market capitalism. So we ask this question that why is a complete, competitive, full information general equilibrium efficient? So Adam Smith's he basically invoked the invisible hand theorem of the market, uh, which is working across all sectors to allocate goods in a way that maximizes the wealth of nations. And although the Smith had no formal concept of general equilibrium in his writings, which is actually Walras was the person who has defined that in 1874. Now, if you look at this, graph, you could see that there is this, simple this supply and demand functions, and there is this equilibrium point, that is P star. And if you look at this there is always this tendency that wherever there is the demand is more than the supply, that means there is a shortage, then there would be a incentive to produce more, and there will be supplies again generated, and then equilibrium is moving from P2 to P star. Similarly, if there is a case where supply is more than demand, then obviously price will fall, isn't it? And the tendency is basically towards equilibrium. This is called the natural equilibrium here. So here what is happening is that the price is driving everything. So here if there is demand, more demand than the supply, then obviously the prices will go up, and once the prices goes up, so there will be incentive for the producers to produce more, and which will again moving towards the equilibrium. And if supply is more, obviously the prices will come down because the demand is low, and that's again the natural tendency is to reach the equilibrium. This is a typical perfectly competitive equilibrium. So now this is what basically the all of this the market capitalist theorists basically propounded that there is, if you give enough incentive to people, if you define your property rights, individual freedom is ensured. Then if people are disclosing everything what they are doing, etc., and everything is determined on the basis of the prices in the market, then this will be the case. It will lead to the efficiency. Now, this is an powerful understanding, and very insightful ideas, but then which is also driving countries' economies moving towards the market capitalist economy, which is even today the dominant force. And but then it's not that everything is fine in market economy. That's basically the point that we will be exploring here. That is that what are the limits to the efficiency of laissez-faire market capitalist economy? Okay. And so when you say that what are the limits to the efficiency of laissez-faire market capitalist economy, we are basically saying is that there are certain things in the market that are actually causing a lot of inefficiencies. So what are those? That's basically the point that we will be exploring. Now here, based on the experiences that the economies have had over the years, these limits to the efficiency of market capitalisms can be grouped under again 6 categories. The limits one is basically the monopoly power, which we all know from our the market structures of the microeconomics, where monopoly and monopolistic competitions comes in a very prominent way. That how does it evolve, and how does it create problems, etc. We will be, briefly discussing that. The second point or second limits to the efficiency of laissez-faire market capitalism is externalities. Now here externalities is again very powerful, limits that actually hinders the way market functions, and it also causes market failure, and that we will look at what economy wide, where lots and lots of market failure in events and evidences are there, and we will basically try to capture from pollutions to technological diffusion and the climate change and other issues. And so then there are also the collective consumption goods, what we call the public goods. Now, as we said that in our introductory classes, that the economy produces two types of goods: one is the public goods and another is the private goods, and lots of goods are also public goods, collective consumption goods, and for that market is ill-equipped to allocate those goods, and there is hardly any incentive to produce such goods, and that is why government intervention is actually prescribed. So all of this becomes again a hindrance for the efficiency, for the market to be efficient, and how it actually makes a market inefficient. That's basically the point that we will be discussing. Then obviously the fourth limits is the imperfect information. Although the perfectly competitive market start with full information assumption, but you and me, we all know that there is nothing called full informations. There are a lot of informations, they are not in the market domain, and people don't know about everything, about consumer preferences or cost of different goods, productions of goods, and so on and so forth. Then of course one of the inputs for production is labor, and that labor, there is of course the problem of the labor unions and how they bring inefficiency in the system, that we will be looking at. Of course, macroeconomic instability of market capitalism is another issue that we will be looking at, because the oscillations of employment, output, inflations, interest, etc., all of them are actually highly unstable under laissez-faire market capitalist system as compared to socialist systems. And why it is so, that we will also discuss. Okay, so these are some of these limits, to some of the limits to market efficiencies. And just 1 second. And so the let us try to understand first the monopoly power, okay, and how it causes market inefficiency. Now, in general, the laissez-faire market capitalisms will not only be completely efficient. This situation is called the problem of market failure. Now, why there is a problem of market failure is basically the monopoly power. The monopoly power is considered as a source of inefficiency, and can arise in a laissez-faire economy. Now, this type of market failure happened in the United States at the end of 1890s, uh, which has actually culminated into a in a great concentrations of monopoly power. That was again attacked by this then president Roosevelt. He brought out the Trust Booster Act in 1901, and so in that basically he tried to curtail this monopoly power, because that is actually creating a lot of inefficiency, cutting down the competitions, etc. And now we know that this is the uh, the diagram where both we are comparing here monopoly and perfect competition's equilibrium, and if you look at pure monopoly, perfect competition equilibrium, that is here MC is intersecting with demand curve, and on the other hand the MC is intersecting with the MR, right, which is the market monopoly equilibrium, which is here. Now, if you compare this monopoly solutions and perfectly competitive market solutions, you could very clearly see that uh, under perfectly competitive solutions, you have higher consumer surplus, that is this part, okay, and also higher level of the producer surplus as well. Whereas if you look at the monopoly equilibrium, where price is higher here, which is basically coming at the expense of the consumer surplus. Okay. The interesting part is that because of the monopoly, power, the society is actually losing these two, B and A, both consumer and producer surplus is actually going out of the systems. That is, neither it is going to the any of these, and that is the major loss to the economy welfare, and what is called it is called deadweight loss, right? And so now theoretically we can see that the two equilibrium basically, one is giving higher level of consumer surplus, higher consumer welfare, and producer surplus as well. The other one is lower one because of the monopoly power. Okay. Now this is one of the important limits to the market efficiency. And but how do government handle this monopoly power? Concentrations of monopoly power depends on the government of the day and also the economy as such, through different rules, regulations, and acts, and trying to bring competition in the market. That's why competition commission is there for in every countries to ensure that no firms gets obsolete monopoly over goods. That's basically the point. But all of these are basically driven by this motive, that by comparing these two, this is what actually comes. Now the other is basically the externalities, the second one. This is another source of inefficiency in market equilibrium. So these are basically either costs or benefits that are borne by or accrue to an agent other than the agent generating them. So that is the concept called externalities. So external costs can be negative externalities. The most controversial one is the environmental pollution, and the external benefits are also positive externalities, such as technological inventions without patent protections or for investors, and so on and so forth, or even the investment in your own garden, which can give benefits to your neighbor, for example, without your neighbor compensating for your costs. So there are a lot of examples of positive externalities. there can be also number of examples of negative externalities. Why it is called externalities in the first place? Now we are discussing the virtue of market capitalism. We are talking about the virtue of market systems, that how market systems generate efficiency in the economy. In the typical market equilibrium, everything is actually internalized. That means that all the costs and benefits associated with the exchange of goods between the buyers and the sellers are internalized. Means that whatever costs and benefits are actually generated from the exchange belong to either the buyer or the seller. It should not spill over to the third persons. Now that is why in case of externalities, all these costs and benefits are actually spilled over to the third party, and that costs and benefits are not confined between the buyers and seller, actual buyers and sellers. That is the whole point. Now how do you, if you look at this, here's the demand of a product, demand for a product. Now demand curve, the marginal cost, this is the private cost, marginal cost, right? And this is where actually the point that where externality is not internalized here. Okay, so of course obviously the consumer surplus is more because prices are low, but there are these social costs that is not included here. If you add the social cost, that is externalities, into the market of into the prices of the good, then the price will go up, and your new equilibrium will be here. That is, the marginal social cost is intersecting with the demand. Okay, and your price is high and quantity produced is low. Okay, and your, as a result, your consumer surplus is low. Now this, because the prices are low and consumer surplus is high, and there is a demand for the goods, and then more goods are produced in the presence of externalities. If you, the moment you internalize the externalities, that will result in low productions, because demand will be less because the prices are going up, higher. And this is basically the point. Now, how do you address these externalities? How do you internalize these externalities? There are four broad approaches are used to resolve this problem of externalities in the market economies. One is that Pigouvian solutions. Okay. The second is command and control, and the third one is the Gaussian approach, what we call Gauss theorem, and the fourth one is the tradable emission permits. Okay. And so now let us look at one by one. Now so the earliest approach was introduced by A.C. Pigou, an Italian economist, who suggested that the taxations of negative externalities and subsidies for positive externalities should be introduced. And this taxation strategy has been, little used in the United States, and countries using it includes France, Germany, with the thrust of their policies being not to raise the cost, so as as to discourage polluters from polluting, but to raise money for subsidy programs that pay polluters to clean up. And so there are basically, the idea is that we have to discourage pollutions, and for that a tax has to be imposed on the producers of the pollution, or generator of the producer who is generating pollution. And so the point is basically is that the second policies, which is widely used in the United States, which is the command and control methods, that is what we call the technological restrictions. And here basically you have this emission standards, liability laws, and all that is basically is the focus. Uh, and so here, uh, of course, all the countries in the world have some sort of command and control methods to have some sort of control over the these producers to reduce externalities, that is the pollution. There is a third approach, basically takes a more laissez-faire attitude and emphasizes the clear definitions and enforcement of property rights. Now, the Gaussian approach, is basically derived from the Ronald Coase. He basically states that if property rights are well defined and transaction costs or the negotiation costs are very negligible or zero, then externalities will be automatically internalized by a market capitalist economy. So Ronald Coase he presented the example of a railroad whose trains generate sparks that start fires on property adjacent to the railroad tracks. So he basically introduced this concept of mutual negotiations between the farmers and the rail authorities. By mutual negotiation, a solution is worked out, such as the railroad compensating the property owners or buying their property. So that some sort of understanding is reached, agreement is reached between the rail authority and the farmers. So by clearly defining the property rights, a situation may be created to have some kind of negotiation between these two individuals without government intervention. So that is basically precisely the point. And so when property rights are poorly defined, means there is no clarity about the boundary and other things, and a natural resource is an open access, right? Nature, open access means anybody can come and use it. Nobody owns the property. Common property resources such as fisheries in international water, there is a tendency for the resource to be overexploited, which is the case. In today, fishery is the most overexploited, depleted resources in the world because nobody owns the international waters. The Coase theorem implies serious limits in terms of basically property rights may be impossible to define, especially in certain cases like international water, and negotiations costs may be very, very high when a large number of stakeholders are involved. Imagine a river is polluted and a lot of fishermen are dependent on that, or farmers are dependent on those water, and organizing all the farmers and negotiating with the industries will be very, very hectic and difficult. So these conditions are likely to coincide when the externality involves an inherently collective good owned by large number of people, such as the global air quality or global climate in discussions about global warming. Now, why there is no agreement, especially among countries reached as far as the global climate is concerned, because of large number of people are involved and they have variety of interests. And that's a typical problems in the Gaussian approach, that when a large number of stakeholders are involved and they are having a collective good like climate, then it will be very, very difficult to reach an agreement. So as the inability of the world leaders to agree on how to implement the Kyoto Protocol on global warming demonstrates negotiations to resolve disagreements are far from costless. It involves costs. Okay. And so what basically the Coase theorem says is that it has generated or stimulated the search for market mechanism to use where possible to resolve pollution problems. So in case of local pollutants, it is possible, quite possible, that the two parties involved in this can come together and negotiate. The other fourth one is that the which is widely used in the United States and other countries is the tradable emission permits. Now here the marketable emission permits directly attack the problems of incomplete markets, underlining the inefficiency of unresolved externalities. So as long as there are enough parties to make such a market reasonably competitive, it will achieve the least costly solutions to clean up the given amount of pollutions. Now, the tradable emission permit concept is very interesting in the sense that uh, you know the local administration has to define how many units of a particular pollutant they fix in a particular year. Let's say they have fixed 300 units of sulfur dioxide in a year, and that 300 units has to be distributed among all the industries in the regions, and everybody will have their they will buy the amount of units that they can pollute, and they have to stick to their limits and the license that they have got. So if some industries they are not able to produce enough goods using the permits, then they can buy the permits from other industries. But overall 300 units will be has to be maintained. So here there will be competition between different firms who can generate surplus permits. Right? Suppose a firm A has got 100 permits and they're able to produce all their productions using, let's say, 75 units. So 25 units they have generated, and that 25 units can be sold in the open market, and that is where the catch is, where the companies or the industry compete to generate surplus, and thereby those surplus can be sold in the market, and that generates a lot of technical efficiencies and other aspects. So therefore the tradable emission permits is one of the very successful interventions by instruments that the many countries uses in solving local pollutions. And so we will discuss this the other uh, two limits tomorrow. And so if you have any questions you can ask, otherwise you can you know you can leave today, and we will meet tomorrow.